Thank you very much for that nice introduction. The text is from my website, and now that I listen to it, it sounds really pretentious. I'm going to try to shorten that down when I get home. All right, so I'm going to talk about under this title, Living with Digital Platforms, Understanding Consumers' Digital Data Disclosure. And the issue here is privacy, and privacy, of course, in a digitalized world. My idea today was to do these four things. So first, maybe just a brief introduction of myself and my work on digitalization of consumption. And then I thought I might summarize the paper that we wrote within this project that I'm going to talk about, and then talk about the paper that I'm actually here to talk about, the one that is still in progress. And of course, also give you like an overall presentation of the project which both these papers adhere to. Right, so I am originally a marketing and consumption scholar, so I come a little bit from business administration, but I worked interdisciplinary almost all my sort of research career, so in departments which combine sociology, anthropology, and so on. So because of this, I have this sort of combination that Cornelia was talking about, that I usually use practice theory, maybe science and technology, and economic sociology, all sort of bundled together. So this is sort of what I brought into this area. I started out interested in sustainability issues like sustainable retailing, alternative food markets, and so on. And then in later years got into, or later, but for at least like 10 years, I've been into this, trying to understand digitalization. So I've had and have a number of different projects on this, but if one was pressed to sort of summarize, I would say that the question that underlies all these projects is, how does digital technology enable and shape consumers' everyday practices? So this is what I've been sort of interested in. How does digitalization change the way we go about sort of our everyday doings? And I've explored this in the areas of, for example, shopping, how smartphones change the way we shop, the way we move around in stores, but also how digitalization changes the way we listen to music, for example, how it changes what we consider music listening and how it sort of integrates music in other ways into everyday life. I've looked also at, of course, how digital technology can be used to promote ethical or sustainable consumption in different ways. Often it's presented like a solution to the problem of sustainability, that as long as we have the right apps or the right page, then we can sort of resolve our problems as consumers and become more sustainable. And finally, I've also been interested in what I like to call digital failures. A lot of the literature on digitalization, especially within marketing studies, tends to focus on the more successful examples of digitalization. So I've tried to sort of turn that around and look at failures. So when it doesn't really quite go as you planned, and digital apps sort of fall off and are not used, which is actually the more normal, common outcome of launching a new app or a new digital platform. And at the moment, I have sort of 4 different projects that connect to this kind of ambition in one way or another. One which is almost ending, alternative food markets. It's not about digitalization per se, but as we try to study how you can organize food markets alternative in a more sustainable way, turns out that digitalization has been sort of a big part in this. So we have a study, for example, on rekoringar, which shows quite interesting, I may say myself, how consumers sort of reappropriate Facebook to organize this kind of local food markets, and how what's a sort of giant corporation and social media platform becomes a tool for the organization of alternative markets. Also working on the issue of circular consumption and the role that sort of digital platforms can have in promoting that. So if these platforms are used by consumers, does it actually change their practices or not? And if so, in what way? And on the sort of similar topic, a project that we just got with the very nice acronym DISCO, which stands for Digital Infrastructures of Sustainable Consumption. We'll look at these issues, but in the context of food waste and everyday mobility. So how apps and digital platforms can be used to change those consumption practices and make them perhaps more sustainable. And sort of lastly, what I'm going to talk about today, this consuming digital data project that has actually ended, at least financially, but not work-wise. All right, this is a project that I have together with my colleague, Niklas Sörum. It's a smaller project, so 2 years, funded by Sparbanksstiftelsen i Varberg, during a time when I was working at the University of Borås. And the focus, as I will talk more about, is understanding consumer experiences and responses to data collection. So it deals with issues of privacy and issues of data security. The background to this project when we were writing the application was, of course, this digitalization of everyday life and how it's changed consumption, and how digitalization has sort of peered into almost every aspect of our everyday practices, from travel, health, and movies, and so on. And if you look, for example, at the surveys conducted in Sweden by, for example, Svenskarna Internet, you can really see that that's really the case. Like 95% of the population use the internet regularly, which is extremely high. Almost everyone sort of engages in e-shopping, streaming music, and the same kind of figures you can find for health services, for traveling, for search engines, for everything. But at the same time that you have this kind of widespread digitalization of everyday life, you also have concern. So people sort of think about the traces that they leave behind. There is a lot of frustration among internet users. And 80%, which is quite high, I was surprised, of the Swedes say today that they take measures to protect their privacy. And half of them actually feels unsafe, which is a sort of more than being concerned. They feel that they could be harmed in one way or another. A lot of them also delete the access that the apps of the information to apps in some way, or take some sort of protective measure on social media of not posting certain things or avoiding topics and so on. And this is widespread among, above all, like 16 to 50 years old. The older sort of users of the internet are more concerned about the fact that they have trouble using the internet and digital technology rather than the privacy issues the survey show. And this mirrors sort of the surveys conducted in other countries like Australia and the UK and so on. Almost all of them show the same thing, that typically people are concerned. They can feel more or less knowledgeable about how this works, and they sometimes take some measures, but not too much, to try and sort of protect themselves and protect their data. So against this background, we were interested in sort of how can this be understood and what shapes consumers' experiences of and their responses to sort of data collection and specifically commercial data collection operations. Now we have like two separately but overlapping answers to that question. That is, we have two papers. One which was recently published in the first issue here of Consumption Markets and Culture, how socio-technical imaginaries shapes consumers' experiences and responses to commercial data collection practices. And the second one, which is a work in progress that I will be talking about later. So I'm going to just briefly summarize this first paper in order to get to the second one. So as I was talking about, we have this sort of ongoing digitalization and datafication, but surprisingly, we know quite little of how this is experienced by consumers. You have these kinds of surveys, and you have a lot of sort of critical accounts of datafication and data bail-ins. So you have a lot of these scholars doing these more sort of macro arguments of why this is wrong and why this is bad. And they might be completely right, but seldom do they study consumers themselves when sort of making this critique. It's a different kind of critique. And then you have a lot of other sort of studies that actually do look at consumers and try to understand their experiences of datafication and privacy issue, but these tend to be sort of influenced, inspired by psychological concepts and microeconomic theory. These are studies mainly within marketing. And of course, the problem becomes that they become sort of very individualistic accounts of consumers and how they relate to data privacy, and sort of explanations that build on cognitive processes and tend to also assign individuals with the whole responsibility of protecting their own data and managing this complex situation. And so in all of this, it sort of overlooks the broader social-cultural and socio-technical processes influencing this issue. So this paper is a way, a response to that, and we want to sort of explore the ways in which consumers experience and respond to datafication, how this is linked to sort of this broader socio-technical imaginaries. All right, and social imaginaries, then sort of a short definition we draw on Lupton, which is not the one who originally coined the concept, but explains it very well, are collectively or publicly held constellations of speculations and narratives that draw on understanding, norms, values, and experiences of the world. So basically, they are sort of cultural resources for making sense of the world. And they are sort of interesting and valuable here because they are both thought of as social and individual. That is, they're socially shared, but experienced individually by the people who sort of reproduce them. But they're also argued to be sort of embodied and materialized in institutions and practices. They're not sort of pure language or pure sort of free-floating. And they incorporate sort of ideas of how we fit together, different actors and expectations we have of one another, but also sort of more factual things, like how are things really, and how should they be, sort of ideas or imaginations of the good and bad society. The literature also sort of accentuates that they can be a social imaginary that is dominant, but there are typically also various of these in circulation. And they can be sort of more or less powerful, and they can also be in conflict with each other. So in our analysis, we focus more specifically on the sort of socio-technical imaginaries, that is sort of social imaginaries of technology, or specifically data collection in this case, and how these shape consumers' views and approach to data collection. So it's both how they experience data collection, but also what they actually do based on how they experience data collection. And what we found are sort of mainly three types these kinds of social imaginaries. So I will sort of exemplify and talk about them briefly. So for many of the people that we talk to, the participants, data collection practices were not something to be feared or avoided, but rather like normal practices that generated benefits for consumers. So this kind of reinforces this dominant economic imaginary in which consumers are a form of exchange, trade their data for benefits. And sort of in many ways, they may be the strongest socio-technical imaginaries circulating. Here we have an example. I can accept providing and giving up my data, even if that partly involves information about me. If it's so interesting that I can get free stuff in return. I get apps for free that would otherwise have cost me money. So here we can see sort of the transactional view of data very clearly. If we're talking about example like apps like Strava, food diary, and apps that helps me, apps that help and are fun. There's also like evaluation of the app and what you get in return. This is particularly meaningful to me, then I'm willing to trade my data for it. You get them for free for just providing my information. As long as you have a decent level of trust in the state, then I think the surveillance society we live in is okay. You are more likely to see creepy stuff if you look at China. Over there it's creepy, but here it's fine, right? So sort of what this shows that the users are typically not sort of ignorant. So it's not a lack of knowledge that makes them sort of uncritical to this data collection, but rather that data collection has become normalized. Many of them are actually quite technically knowledgeable and could speak at length about how platforms work, how they collect data, and so on. We can also see a contrast here between sort of the critical accounts, which position these consumers as sort of passive, and how they see themselves as active agents participating in economic exchange. So they're selling the data and getting a service. They don't see themselves as victims at all. They see themselves as having agency to do this. And here sort of datafication and data bailers are seen as something positive that produce convenience, like relevance, and of course a better service altogether. In many cases, you also see sort of an appreciation of being seen by the market. This is something that has been touched upon in the literature before, that contrary to what many of these critical accounts sort of propose, some consumers actually appreciate of being surveillance, that they feel special when someone knows so much about them and is willing to invest in learning more about them. So when they sort of reproduce this socio-technical imaginary, they see the data provisioning or data collection as an extension of their agency. By doing this, they can achieve things that they couldn't achieve otherwise. But of course, not everyone is positive, and some are quite critical. So we had also the example of the reproduction of data collection as entrapment, in which you have a much more sort of negative or dystopian imaginary of data collection. And here we have an example of that. Well, who knows? You kind of just accepted it. Everything you just tick off and agree to. I guess that I've kind of signed away my rights to a lot of things, like selling my personal information. Then the interviewer, which is Niklas, asked, do you read things like terms and conditions? Well, I feel like that race is over. For example, if we take Facebook, I don't know, they must have changed their T's and C's over the years, and I probably automatically agreed to them. I don't know, it feels like I'm getting new questions from them all the time. So you have this kind of resignation that it is very too complicated, too much to take in. Is it worth really looking through it? You sort of almost give it up here. And then you have sort of an explanation for that. In the second part here, Philip talks about how these kind of apps or platforms are so embedded in everyday life that he doesn't feel that he has the possibility to actually escape them. He is afraid of losing Messenger, for example, which is connected to Facebook. He doesn't care that much about Facebook, but he wants to still have Messenger. He uses it in private life, he uses it at work as well. So here we see that this digital platform has sort of waved its way into everyday life. And because of that, they don't feel that they have sort of the agency to change that. So here in this sort of category, we see this kind of negative view of data collection. They're very critical of it, but they don't act on it. They feel sort of this resignation. And they accept this and see it more as an inevitable situation. This is where we ended up, more or less, and I can't do anything about it. So why they reproduce sort of this dystopian socio-technical imaginary, at the same time they feel disempowered, they feel limited, and they feel that they can't do anything about it. So it's in many ways sort of the complete opposite of the first socio-technical imaginary. And third and last, we have sort of the activist imaginary. And here we see that they're also sort of negative towards data collection, but they have a different approach to it. Here we see Casper talking about, right, so I've changed to other products to feel that I have more control of what kind of data I share. So critical, but sort of aware or at least believes that he has something that he can do about it. I use an app called Signal. It's a free app that's encrypted. I use ad blocker services and a browser that doesn't send any of my personal information to their service. No data to help improve their services or anything about my online surfing. And then you see sort of this idea of also thinking about the future and how bad things can get. So it's not only that the current situation is bad, but they also perceive that the future might be even worse. You never know. In a future with a lot of profiling of people, you never know what kind of data could be used if society changes. Think in terms of change of government or insurance company buying this data and then denying you specific services or figuring out that you are developing a serious disease or stuff like that. So it bothers me that they might know who I am, and I don't want to go on for several years so that they have a real profile of me. I want to feel that I can get rid of it. It's almost like Minority Report, like pre-crime. So he connects to this science fiction movie, which I don't know if you've seen, but great movie, I can recommend it, in which actually it's not technology, it's psychics in the movie, but you have seen several sort of similar arguments made from AI, that eventually we will be able to predict what people do. And once we do that, the question is, should we stop them from doing things that we can predict that they're going to do? So he's very worried about that. And this is sort of the dystopian view that he sees of the future. But the difference here is that they see the opportunity for them to change that in some way. So here they sort of see themselves as a different kind of actor. A data activist of some sort. What we're talking about is more sort of mundane sort of resistance, but they see that they have agency. They do a lot of these different things to try to delimit the kind of data they can get from them. So the conclusion that sort of we make in this paper is that it's valuable to, of course, use these kind of social technical imaginaries, and we can see how they come to shape the way that consumers not only experience it, how they feel about it, how they see it, but also what they actually do in relation to these platforms. And they draw on this sort of widely dispersed social technical imaginaries, which are social, but sort of enact them also individually in their everyday lives. And in each of these different social technical imaginaries, consumers had a different sort of role. So in the first one, they were empowered and were sort of an economic agent of transaction. In the second one, they were powerless completely, sort of victims to the digital platforms. And in the third one, they were potentially powerful data activists. And important also to say is that while the consumers we talk to typically sort of lean towards one or the other, they could at times sort of switch between these kind of social technical imaginaries. So moving on to the next paper, which we're trying to develop to sort of analyze the same data, but complement the first paper, focus more sort of squarely on the role of digital platforms, of practices, and the role of sort of technology. Well, the background is basically the same. Like you have this identification, and you have a lot of critical accounts. You have a few studies that look at individuals. And the explanations that are usually given in this more sort of individualistic tradition have to do with things like privacy calculus, that consumers will evaluate and calculate if this is beneficial for them or not, and then make a decision, which is basically the same sort of notion of consumers that exists in a lot of marketing research that looks at decision making. But you also have some that argue that consumers carry out sort of a risk analysis, that they look at the kind of platforms or the companies behind them and sort of figure out that, okay, I trust this one, but not that one. So I will change my data settings here, but will give them all the data in the other one. And then finally, there's the explanation that consumers simply have sort of different values. So sometimes they care about data privacy and sometimes they don't. But in all these cases, they sort of make this kind of rational decisions as individuals, so freely sort of to disclose or not disclose their data. That's sort of what the research is reproducing. And sort of we argue that this is actually not possible because of the position that the digital platforms have in consumers' everyday life. Because they're so embedded in the things that we do, you are not able to sort of freely decide if you want to join or not. that you cannot be this kind of autonomous agent and individually just say, okay, I'm not joining that, at least not in the way that they sort of propose. So we try to shift the focus because at the same time, they're not completely without agency. As we saw in the first survey, people are doing stuff to try and limit what the kind of information that they give out. So they're doing something. And we thought it might be interesting to understand exactly what they're doing. So we propose a shift more towards sociological research on data practices. So our aim in this paper is to sort of understand the various digital data disclosure practices performed by consumers and how they are shaped by the digital platform that they are connected to. Now, to do that, we draw on practice theory, and I will just very briefly mention practice theory. Of course, a broad sort of theoretical framework that focuses on practices rather than understandings or discourses on social interaction. And it comes from the sort of almost reinvention of practices. So around the 2000, Reckwitz and Chatsky mainly took a lot of components from previous social scholars like Garfinkel and Giddens and Bourdieu, and sometimes even Latour is mentioned as one of these practice theory ancestors, and then sort of reformulated and gave us like a formula for practice theory and trying to promote this more focus on practices and everyday doings. And practices are, of course, defined differently, but the definition that I like is the Reckwitz one, which define practice as a routine type of behavior which consists of several elements interconnected to one another: bodily activity, mental activity, things and their use, background knowledge, forms of understanding, know-how, emotions, motivational knowledge. Very long, but also shows that this is a very complex unit that sort of unifies things that have previously been discussed in isolation, like emotions, like understandings, body, mind, so on and so forth. So this has sort of moved and become very popular in consumption studies, especially in sort of the sociology of consumption, which is a form of subfield there. And it's been used to sort of redefine consumption. So Alan Ward, which is maybe the one that has sort of launched practice theory in consumption, uses it to define consumption as a process whereby agents engage in the appropriation and appreciation, whether for utilitarian, expressive, or contemplative purposes, of goods, service, performances, information, or ambience, whether purchased or not, over which the agent has some degree of discretion. Now, this is a very broad definition of consumption that sort of shows that it's a process, that it can involve different things, and it doesn't have to be things that are purchased, right? However, if we follow this definition, then the digital data disclosure is not a form of consumption. It's not something we do to consume an object. Rather, it's something that happens as part of consuming other things, digitalized practices, or the consumption of digital objects themselves. So, to try to understand how we can conceptualize this data disclosure as a practice, we draw on the distinction in practice theory between integrative and dispersed practices. So integrative practices are what we can call like the common practices, the complex unit, standalone practices. They are consist of all these elements that we talked about, and they are held together by a teleoaffective structure, sort of an idea of what the practice should be, a way of feeling about that practice, purpose, if you may. Examples of like soccer, dancing, eating, basically almost every practice you can think of. Dispersed practices, on the other hand, are more sort of simple practices, and they're usually just elements in other practices. And they're also conceptualized as not having a teleoaffective structure in their own right. So they have no sort of standalone purpose. They exist only as part of other practices to support those practices. And examples are typically reading, explaining, walking, this kind of more generic stuff. There are usually components in other practices. So we use this distinction and practice theory broadly to sort of say three things. One is that digital data disclosure practices refers to the ways in which users provide information onto a digital platform. So this can involve both accepting just the collective of information sort of more passively, or more actively manually entering information. But it can also involve refusing to provide personal data, or sometimes, as we will see later, provide the wrong data. And we also argue that data disclosure can be seen as a complex dispersed practice. It's not a standalone practice. No one does this just to do this. You do it as part of an integrated practice of using social media, of traveling and using an app, of using a health service. And then as part of that, you do this kind of digital data disclosure. And finally, we also sort of accentuate and draw on the tendency of practice theory to accentuate social materiality, the things, and we say that these practices are of course also connected to the specific digital platforms on which they are performed. Now the study, this is the same study for the first paper, is an interview study with 17 Swedish participants, 2.5 hours long. Some inspiration from the walking through method in the sense that we ask people to show us the different sort of platforms, how they use them, how they connect to them in different spheres of practice. And this was a quite difficult sort of interview guide to develop compared to many of our other studies, because it turns out it's quite difficult to talk about digital data disclosure because it's so embedded in other practices. So we went through different areas, and we wanted to know sort of where both their use of digital platforms, so what's the basis, like in what aspects of your life do you use various digital platforms, and then how do you sort of disclose or not disclose your personal data on these specific platforms. So we wanted to know both what was done and the understandings and concern involved, but also sort of the aim or the goal of the practices that they carried out. These are the participants, and as you can see, it's a bit limited in the age, and so we don't have the younger, like 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. We don't have the elderly. Now, the elderly don't seem that concerned, so they would not make sense. But a younger group of informants would definitely have made sense to see the difference in time in the practice that we will talk about. Okay, so what does the analysis show then? Well, it does show that consumers are sometimes knowledgeable, although sometimes the digital platforms also remain sort of obscure to them, black boxed. They are concerned in some cases, but not others, and they perform a variety of data disclosure practices. So this is what we have tried to sort of categorize, the different things that people do in relation to digital data disclosure. And I will talk a little bit about each of these and exemplify them before sort of ending with some conclusions. Right, so the first one is that we found is trading, which is basically a confirmation of much of this research that argues that consumers should see themselves as economic agents, and also connected to this first social technical imaginary. So this involves both accepting personal data collection and entering manually. Here, data collection is seen as necessary, and providing data, they argue or sort of say that it can be inconvenient, but they're usually not concerned. So they think it can be a hassle, but they're not worried about it. And personal data is here provided to get a service, to be able to perform sort of the integrative practice that you wanted to perform to begin with. So, but it's not sort of a source of value in itself. And here we have Hannah, which is sort of contrasting different apps. It's a different thing. When I have been picking mushrooms all summers, I have no sense of direction, so I get easily lost. So I got this app that is used by hunters, where you can see exactly where you have been walking, and you can get the route in different colors, so you can follow the same route back. and others who have the app, if you granted access, can see exactly where you are. When Maria and I were with the horses, we got lost, but the second time we had the app with us and could see and follow our route. This is an example of something that I think is okay. So what's interesting here is that Hannah differentiates. If it was a digital platform that she doesn't find valuable, then she is, of course, critical and reluctant to provide the data. But if it is an app, a digital platform that is meaningful, crucial to her life, she is willing to do this trade-off. So it shows that they clearly differentiate between digital platforms. It's not that they have the same approach to every platform, or not necessarily. All right, the second category, which we call sort of fine-tuning, involves sort of providing personal data or additional personal data. And here data collection is seen as part of sort of service development. So they think in terms of they need the data to develop the service, to make it better. And providing data is then seen as a way of fine-tuning the service that you get. You want to sort of help out. So you provide personal data, and this adds values to integrity practice that you have carried out. So improves the practice that you are performing by providing data. So it's slightly different from the trade-off, in which you see the provision of data as a necessary evil. Here you see it as a value-adding activity. Let's see, we have Frederick talking about Netflix, and it's easier to give it a thumbs up so they can give me suggestions. I mean, many times, if you want to watch a specific movie, then you have to know the name of the movie. But if I can get them to do the job for me, we think you like this. It feels easier. So here he provides data, additional data, to improve the service. And by doing that, improve the integrity practice that he's carrying out. And the final of the sort of more positive practices is what we call mining. And this involves sort of providing data, often sort of additionally, often manually. It's seen as sort of laborious, but rewarding. And here it's a way to sort of accumulate benefits, often in some form of currency. And the end goal is to produce value for oneself. And here we have Linda talking about how she connects her buying to her card and loyalty program each time she goes to the store. And now they see what I'm buying. I'm usually getting personalized discounts based on what I buy. Say I want those goods, and so it's okay. I get notifications on new products, members, prices, and then when I shop there, the money is turned into points that one uses in a points shop. I have gotten tons of things through there, through the years, tickets, all kinds of things. So here we see someone who's willing to actually provide data to add to it, to get a form of currency back, something that not only improves the specific service or the in specific integrity practice in your carrying out, but actually you can use to do other things or buy other things. All right, so the first sort of more negative practice is what we call cloaking. So here you sort of provide the wrong data or limited data to the platform. And here it's clear that data collection is something invasive, something that you want to sort of avoid. But the end goal is to be able to use the digital platform, perform the practice, but become less visible. You want to use it, but you want to stop them from seeing. This latest, what I call and he checks his phone, lockdown. It's a firewall of sorts. It blocks, prevents all other apps to access information. It just sits there in the background. And then if you, for example, go on Aftonbladet's website, the Aftonbladet cannot see the information to someone else. It blocks all cookies and all information about me that I send off to another actor. I've only had it for 2 weeks, but I think in a week it gives you weekly reports. It has blocked 2,000 requests. So Yuan wants to continue to use all the same platforms that he usually does, but he wants to prevent them from seeing him. So this is sort of what we term cloaking. Then we have sort of minimizing. In this case, they're more sort of willing to reduce how much they use the platform in order to reduce the personal data that you are giving them. So here consumers understand that data is collected in multiple ways, that it's not only asked for, but everything you do on a platform leaves a trace. And they try to reduce those traces by using it as little as possible. And here we have Frederick again, and he talks about sort of not using Facebook as much as he used to. So he's reducing his use of Facebook because he feels that they track him. And now, in the beginning, it sounded really radical. He doesn't use Facebook anymore. He has deleted the app and so on. But it turns out that he's just deleted it from the phone. So he's still using it on his computer, but by deleting it from the phone, he's diminishing his usage of the app and thereby also reducing the information that it hands out. All right. And the last one is, of course, the most sort of radical, in which you have consumers who are opting out completely from using a platform in order to avoid being sort of surveillanced. So this can be that you just stop using it, or that you switch to an alternative that doesn't collect data. And here you also have the idea that data collection is very invasive, and often they're just more sort of engaged in the idea that they don't want anyone to collect data on. And here we have Anders, who stopped using Instagram. And he did that not only because of the sort of data that they collect about him, but also because of the data that other people share about him. He felt that it was too invasive to be in part of this kind of social media platforms. So sort of trying to summarize these different data disclosure practices, they all had sort of specific set of actions that were involved in terms of providing or not providing data, providing the wrong data, and so on. They all sort of build on specific understandings of data collection. Data collection could be necessary, it could be valuable, it could be a form to gain currency, it could be invasive, it can be threatening in different ways. And they all had sort of different specific goals to get access, to navigate the service, to improve the service, to get additional benefits, to use it, and to reduce and to sort of deny personal data altogether. So there are sort of very different ways of trying to manage the data that you give to different digital platforms. Now, what we're thinking about now, and sorry for the model, although I am from marketing, I'm very bad at doing models. But the idea that we're thinking about now is how does this connect to the digital platform? And sort of as dispersed practices, these practices are shaped both by the integrity practice, sort of the main practice that you're doing, and also by the digital platform and sort of their data collection operations. So for example, if you are quite positive and you're trading, and then the data collection, the digital platform can push you towards fine-tuning, towards mining, by sort of enticing you with benefits and so on. But also sort of the integrity practice, if it, depending on how meaningful, how central it is to your life, it will change which of these practices seems more feasible. So defecting would not be a feasible option for someone who, for example, uses Messenger, as we saw in everyday life for everything, to stay connected with friends, family, and workmates. So for them, cloaking or minimizing would be the only sort of possible practices. So these kind of digital data collection practices are then shaped both by the main practice, which they're part of, but also by the sort of social material script of the digital platform. And this is just an example. Like, for example, if we were talking about Facebook, which I don't think has the opportunity for mining, but you can do trading and fine-tuning, then integrity practices will be posting or following or participating in groups and so on. And a lot of people, for example, talked about the importance of joining groups, that they have groups to organize everything from going to concerts to sort of work events. So they felt that they cannot sort of leave out that practice. They cannot sort of step out from Facebook together because of that. So depending on the digital platform, that's sort of one of the important things, and its social material script what it wants from you, what it sort of tells you to put in, shapes sort of the data, the digital data collection, but also the role that that platform has in your life shapes that. So it depends on if Facebook is really central to you or if it's just in the periphery of your life. It will shape these practices differently. The paper is not done, but sort of the preliminary conclusions that we are kind of moving towards is, first of all, sort of a confirmation of the starting point that individual decision making is not really possible, at least not as autonomous agents, because of the integration of these platforms in everyday lives and sort of the complexity of the platforms also, as we saw. So instead, various digital data disclosure practices are performed, but the same consumer can perform different of these practices. So these are not categories of consumers. And as dispersed practices, they're shaped both by the integrative practice on the digital platform. So by sort of carrying out these practices, they are able to access digital platforms and still use them, but sort of manage what they see as the negative results. Or if they are unconcerned, they can sort of exchange, fine-tune, actually create value through these kind of digital platforms. Or sorry, this kind of data disclosure practices. So what we're sort of trying to argue that consumer data disclosure practices then cannot be fully understood without sort of understanding how they connect to different platforms and the role that these platforms have in people's everyday life, which would mean that you cannot fully understand sort of data privacy issues by just asking in surveys, because you have to sort of contextualize that information. You have to look at what digital platform are we talking about and what role does that digital platform have in the life of consumers. Thank you.